I'm Heidi Zuckerman. I've spent my life connecting people to art to make their lives better. This podcast talks about art in contemporary culture and why we should care. Each episode is an impactful conversation with people I find interesting and think you will too, about their life, values, and always about why they think art matters. This is Conversations About Art. JiaJia is a digital strategist and founder of the first digital agency for art. After more than a decade of working in museums, her new practice is centered around the mission of making art more accessible through technology. We discussed being an evening person, access to free art museums, how to find your own information, the future of funding and philanthropical access to techpreneurs, and how art can exist for the screen. Finally, what could be our shared Kurt Vonnegut epithet?
Now that things have gotten really busy, there's definitely like a clear delineation of like email activity between weekend and weekday. And then of course I try not to schedule meetings on the weekend too. So the Zooms are declining.
I actually throughout this entire process have tried to sort of practice the weekend because I think that matters, psychologically too.
Yeah, definitely. I sent my friend just a very casual DM last weekend. She works at Instagram. I just had like a really small question, and we're pretty close, but she has like a very strict policy about emails and weekends. So she just told me like, oh, just send me an email, and I like don't check it on the weekend. And I'm like, that's like a really brave thing to say. To have that clarity and delineation, because you can with all of the inbound messages that come through so many different channels.
And to be honest, I have sort of a pathology where, I don't know, it's almost like tennis, like a message comes in and I just immediately feel like I have to return it, like get the ball back across the net. And
I know I'm OCD like that as well. I have to reach inbox 0 at the end of the day. So it's like a psychological race against myself.
Me too. Okay. I wonder what we could do to move away from that patterning. So
I think that's just how we were designed. I don't know about you, but I have some friends who are the total opposite. And I often get a heart attack when I look at their phones because I'll see like a 5-digit number on their email app of like unread email. And it's the same with like text messages and voicemails. And I just can't imagine how anyone would be able to live that way.
You and I are exactly the same. And I have the same thing. It gives me heart palpitations to see that. And their perspective when I ask them is, well, anything that's important, I would have already heard about in some other way, which I've been really working on kind of trusting, that everything works out the way it's supposed to, and, choosing freedom over control and all of these different philosophical practices. But somehow the idea that you could live with 5 digits worth of text messages or emails, the majority of which probably you've never seen, that is just not viable for me. So
yes, it makes me physically uncomfortable as well.
What did you do today?
What did I do today? My days always start the same. My cat wakes me up really early in the morning. I feed my cat and then I feed myself. And I have a new routine, which is not checking my phone in the morning, not looking at the news until I have time to just empty my mind and just leave time for myself. And so I've tried to, work out a little bit in the morning and just listen to the radio in the background. and then eat breakfast. And then after I'm done with that, I'll turn on all of my devices. I used to wake up to all of the emails that came from whatever time zone, flooding my inbox. And again, it was this race to just get to zero before my day started. And of course, you would just never end. And then I realized I missed out on just so much precious time that I would have in the morning, without other interaction, physical or digital. And it really just helps you take care of yourself. And then of course the emails started and the meetings started. So I resumed my digital existence.
So I wake up pretty early every morning, and the last few days there's been a Instagram live by this guru that I don't personally know, but he's a favorite of a friend of mine, Rich Roll, who was on an earlier podcast of mine. And Rich has had him as a guest something like 7 times. And so I thought, well, if he likes him so much, I'm curious what it is about him. So I've gone on a couple of those lives, joined a couple of those lives the last few mornings. And this morning, he was talking about the difference between our true nature and sort of like personal preference. And he was talking about how sometimes people say they're a morning person or they're an evening person, and that some of that is really just kind of personality instead of nature. But do you have ways that you think about yourself?
I was just thinking about this. I have a astrology, and so I have fake science belief that so much of your life was determined at birth. And I was born in the evening. I think it was around 9:15, and I've always been more of an evening person. And I also know people, after finding out their time of birth, people who've been born early in the morning who are decisively more morning people. More recently, I've started, just because of life, waking up early, but I do find that I'm most alert and focused, whether it's writing or some type of creative activity at night. I think I was born this way.
How did you find your way to art, and how would you describe your relationship to art?
I think that's a really long story. And again, it happened a while ago. I would go back to my childhood. And it's really interesting to speak about this now because I'm in my childhood bedroom where I grew up, which is outside of DC. I was born in Shanghai. My parents are both medical doctors. Now they're research scientists. They work for the NIH. And because I grew up in Washington, I had access to art museums at a really young age. I started going to museums with my parents, and then even throughout high school. I think it was because I was a big nerd. Instead of going out, I would just go to the Smithsonian. And of course, because the museums were all free, there was just incredible access to culture that I otherwise wouldn't have. I think the way that I got into art was very much my own journey of self-discovery, because it wasn't until, I got to college, and started meeting more people who are quote unquote in the art world, where I realized so many people really grew up with, parents who were either collectors or, very much people who were actively within the industry, I guess. But my parents aren't art people at all. And I think even myself, giving myself the chance to realize that I could study art was, I keep telling people that it was my coming out moment when I told my parents, of course, my Chinese doctor parents, that I wanted to study art history instead of biology. They had a complete heart attack and, not joking, threatened to stop paying for my tuition. And that coming out moment was just really important to me because I had no idea what I would do with a degree in art. I had, I guess my parents even said to me at some point, "What are you going to do? Work in a museum?" And here I am. But I think, it was something that I always had gravitated towards. Like even as a child, I knew I was just very sensitive to my aesthetic surroundings. I loved to draw. I loved making art. Um, in high school, I had an art teacher who taught us contemporary art. I think that was extremely rare for something at a public school. And I started going to the Hirshhorn Museum. We had she invited one of her former students to talk about what she was studying in college, and it wasn't until then that I realized you could study art history. And so I always had that in the back of my mind. I knew that I loved looking at pictures, creating pictures. The visual world was something that just gave more meaning into my life, and found a path that seemed right to me because everything else seemed wrong.
Very interesting, and maybe surprisingly, maybe unsurprisingly, a lot of parallels to my path as well. One of the things that you said that I hadn't thought about, and I'd love to talk with you about, because I have a feeling it might be impactful in how you are working with art now, is this idea that a lot of people you have met in the art world had a story about kind of a legacy in the art world, that their parents were collectors, or that it was kind of a multi-generational approach. And I often talk about how my grandmother was a collector and also how my parents hated art. So those two things kind of together, but I had that access generationally. And I wonder if, knowing that's why you're interested in bringing more people to art. Does it have to do with the viability of trying to create access to art for people that don't come from that sort of legacy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think every step of my journey was a sense of discovery that there were so many other art worlds beyond the mainstream art world we can think of. And this idea of representation and inclusion is so important. I, grew up in a pretty homogenous, community in terms of, my high school environment, my higher education environment. I was the only woman of color studying art history at my school. Of course, I went to a women's college, so it was all women. And, it was very clear after even getting my first museum job that it was a very homogenous workforce. And there were just so many other aspects of art history that weren't taught in school that I had to go out there and find my own information. And I think being someone who entered the workforce at a time where the internet became such an unprecedented tool to accessing art was incredible. And I think I was able to meet a lot of people, not only professionally through, art, professional channels, but, meeting and discovering a new community of people online. And being able to forge those connections later on in person was really important. And, without all of those things together, I think my career would be very different. And I think I always tell people that there's so many positions that I had ultimately that didn't even exist before when I was a student. So there's so much that's changed over the last several years. And I think there's going to be so much more change, particularly when it comes to technology, when it comes to having a more global and also inclusive perspective.
The combination of art and technology and where those intersect is how I think about your practice and your approach, and this idea of finding new ways to find your own information, looking for things that weren't sort of readily available or maybe obvious in terms of how they were presented. There are a lot of different ways to search for that information, and certainly technology now is probably the most viable. I'm guessing that when you started doing that, that wasn't the default. And I wonder if you can talk about how you found your way there and how you still look for information that other people don't have.
Yeah, I think so much of my career was motivated from being always a little curious and always a little autodidactic. I am always interested in finding the answer myself. And then, just because of the nature of how technology works, you kind of have to do that because there isn't a class or a set of instructions for everything, given how quickly things move. But it happened to me on both sides. I mean, I came from a liberal arts background, and because, just by chance, I didn't want to pay someone to design my own website, I taught myself how to code to do it myself. And then, of course, accidentally, that brought on a whole set of other opportunities. I think I honestly learned more about art outside of the classroom as well, just from going to museums, going to gallery shows. Later in my life, becoming friends with more artists. There's so many things that happen outside of the scholarly environment of, reading essays and looking at slides. Art is so organic, almost as rapidly evolving and changing as technology in some ways. It should be a reflection of our world, and it keeps changing. And I think those two worlds in parallel have always been, if you look at the concentric circle, a very small overlap, but to me, I find a lot of commonalities and a lot of ways that the two worlds can help each other.
So when you can't sleep, whether that's late at night or first thing in the morning, and you are thinking about things that you're excited about, what are they?
That's a great question. I have a very OCD mindset, and so when I go to bed at night, I like my day-to-day consciousness. I just make lists of things I'm going to do, and to me, I just feel that that's kind of the only way that I can move forward. So I go in, I guess, order of like minutia to like big picture. So I think about, these are the tasks I have to accomplish tomorrow, and then these are the tasks I have to accomplish next week, and then it kind of goes on and on. But I think the long game for me has always been finding a way to connect both the art and tech piece, because there's so many ways in which that's really important and will determine the future of both industries. I always tell people when it comes to how we can maintain survival, when you look at funding and philanthropy in our world today, all of the world's biggest billionaires and, entrepreneurs right now are in technology. And, the people who are in technology don't care about art. The people who used to fund museums, if you think about the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and this very unique history of philanthropy that happens in America, that generation is dying or has died. And the only way we can continue to fund wide access to art is by forging a connection between the art and the tech worlds. And that's just never been successful. And I think there have been small instances of really exciting collaborations, whether it's been between museums and some of these tech companies. But there hasn't been this symbiosis that really will take us into the future. And I think because of that, I've always been really concerned about just kind of the future of everything. I think there's so much uncertainty, particularly now. That's kind of the big challenge that I don't know if I'll be able to solve, but something that's always been in the back of my mind.
So when I think about art and technology, it's clear to me that art needs technology. And it's also pretty clear to me currently that technology doesn't need art. My dad is an inventor. He was an early Silicon Valley entrepreneur. One of my iconic stories was as a kid, my dad taking me into his office in Cupertino or somewhere around there, Sunnyvale maybe, and opening the door to a room which was filled with a huge box, and it was kind of vibrating. And he said, that's a personal computer. By the time you're a grown up, you'll be able to hold that on your lap. So I was sort of the default IT person because I knew more about technology than anyone else on the team. I mean, quickly the technology went up on a kind of a hockey stick, and my knowledge wasn't there, but I was the one that was kind of fixing everyone's computer. And I have a long relationship to technology, but you'll remember I also said that my parents hated art. So I also know that gap that's there. That's my personal experience about tech and art, and the sort of dismissal, because my parents also wanted me to be a lawyer and did not support my choice to study art history and to go and work in a museum. I wonder if you have a personal story like that, and or why you think in a more universal way technology and speaking in these very sort of broad terms, hasn't needed art yet.
I just remembered there's this amazing Kurt Vonnegut quote about what you just said that I have to read to you. He said, if you want to really hurt your parents and you don't have to be gay, the least you can do is go into the arts. I think that's going to be our
awesome.
I
think so.
What was your question? Sorry.
No, that's so great. I love that.
I had to quickly Google that for you.
I appreciate it. My question was really, why do you think tech has a disdain for art in the most kind of broadest way? Because I don't think it's just a disinterest. I think that there's a disdain.
Oh, absolutely. Again, this is something that goes back to childhood. I feel like it's back to accessibility. If you look at anyone's long-term interest in culture, in going to museums and supporting culture, it's because they grew up with that. It's because their parents took them to these cultural experiences. They found value in, looking at pictures in the same way that we value literacy and reading books. I think because of how most people grow up in America, because of the very little access to culture, people, particularly in the tech industry, because these are basically kids. These are kids who dropped out of college and decided to start their own companies. And there's a sense of alienation that is very prevalent, whether or not you are someone who even has had higher education. I think even the most highly educated people, when you walk into a Chelsea gallery or any type of white cube contemporary art space, there's very little that the institution or the gallery offers for someone who's not already familiar and speaks that language. And because of that, I think it's kind of relationship that's been ongoing. It's the sense of alienation that probably happened early on in their lives. Art has never been of value to them. Art never gave them anything. And as a result, now that all of the world's biggest companies are responsible for a global economy, in return, art isn't really something that they want to give back to. And so to change that, I think it has to go both ways. I think we have to work to make whatever we do in whatever spaces, digital or online, more accessible to more people. Only until people find value and meaning do they support.
I agree with you on the need for access to art. The problem that I'm trying to solve is that people think contemporary art isn't available to them. How do you think art can become more accessible to a broader audience? If you could wave a magic wand, for example, and make 3 things happen, what would they be? No constraints of money, time, space, etc.
The first thing I would do would be to make museums free to everyone. I think that is such a low barrier that I can't believe all museums haven't met yet. I think even financially, museum admission is such a tiny part of most revenue. And, without that barrier, you really exclude a lot of people who can't come into the building. I think the first barrier is just something that can really help with, access to museums in the same way that we think about access to books in a library. I think there should be more museums. They don't necessarily need to be these mega church architect design spaces. They don't need to be these symbols of state power. They really just need to be community centers that serve their immediate communities. I think there will be significant changes in the art world coming in the next couple months, couple years, and particularly focus on local audiences. I think because of potential limitations to travel, we're not going to be able to consume culture in the same way that we used to. And I think in a way, everyone acknowledged but never really addressed that it was really unsustainable. So I think just thinking about how do we break down the concept of the cultural institution. We expect people to use these spaces, but unless they're widely available, you're not able to reach a huge part of the population. The other thing that's incredibly important we keep going back to is just this idea of multi-generational access to art. I think having inclusion in academic programs, in early childhood education is so important. There's a huge difference between the way Americans appreciate culture and if you look at Europe and how integrated it is in most education systems. There's a lifelong interest in learning and curiosity that a lot of people have that, most Americans, I would say, simply don't care about because it again falls back on accessibility and, what you would get out of that experience. What's the third thing? Oh my God. I think, the art world just needs to stop being so hierarchical. By design, there's so many levels to the way in which this whole ecosystem runs. It's like, I've heard people describe it as a scheme wherein if everyone in the art world, had the laws of finance applied to them, everyone would be in jail. It's this crazy scheme that everyone's in. It makes no sense. And yet we're all vitally connected to each other for survival. And I think it just takes one sector to break out of the cycle to kind of reimagine how we can make it better.
There's a lot of talk about the aura of the art object and the power of the art object and the need to be in physical proximity to an artwork to really see it and feel it and know it. Are there things that you think could augment, and I don't mean like AI or VR or whatever, but are there experiences or ways of thinking or looking that you think could augment experience with looking at or experiencing a work of art that you're not able to be with in person, that you can only have access to virtually or through a screen?
Absolutely. I think that's a very frequently asked question these days as we're looking at all art for our screens right now. I've always been very skeptical of programs and experiences that translate physical objects and physical experiences onto the screen. I think even though there have been some really interesting projects done in VR and AR and various emerging technologies, there's always something off. And the point of that is the whole idea of taking something physical and putting it on the screen sort of goes against the nature of technology in and of itself. I think instead of thinking about how we can take something that is a really complicated interface, architecture and physical spaces, and even art is so multifaceted. It could be a performance, it could be a 4-channel video installation. Instead of taking all those elements and putting them onto a 2D screen, I think we should be thinking more about how art can exist for the screen. I think there's so many artists who are exploring things on even film and video and, visual experiences that can happen through the existing tools of our time. I don't think we need to be pursuing new technologies to solve this problem that really creates a more alienating experience. I don't know about you, but every time I put on a VR device, I just get instantly nauseous and confused and want to put it down. And again, I think, it also contradicts so much of why people want to experience art. Art is very much a social experience. And when you put on these devices, you end up in this very solitary environment that's confusing and cold. And I think it's also really unsustainable given how quickly everything emerges. There just hasn't been a perfect way of doing that unless the intention is to look at art on a screen.
Mm-hmm. What have you done that you're the most proud of?
What have I done? I think beyond work, beyond actual projects, I think I'm just the most proud of being able to share my visual world with people online. I think that's the goal of everything that I do at work, even. I think everything that I've done has been about trying to find a way to translate my love of art to a broader audience. And I think there's just so many opportunities that more people should be taking advantage of. And I love that I've been able to help, strangers and, whoever they are on the internet, try to see how I see.
When I joined the staff of the Berkeley Art Museum and I was in my interview process, I remember asking some of the people who became my future colleagues who they thought the competition was. And they sort of recoiled from that question and said, we're a museum, we don't have competitors. And I said, well, actually, every business, a museum is a business, every business has competitors. Who are you trying to emulate? Whose program do you admire? Who do you think you're ahead of? Who do you think you're behind? Asking you that question in terms of art and technology, are there people whose work you really admire or who you think have done really well?
Yeah, there's so many. I think because so much of what I've done is kind of a fusion of various things, I just, love seeing when people out there are finding their own path and finding their own niche. I've always been really impressed by Paola Antonelli at MoMA and, really being the go-to expert in that space. One of the, most dynamic exhibitions I ever saw was when she did Talk to Me. I think this was like 2010, like over 10 years ago. And, I've always respected people as well who've been able to be really radical while still, working within the system and, trying to make an impact change from within. So I think I've always been someone who's, tried to, do new things, but I think, it's most impactful when, you recognize the labor and also the multifaceted structures around what can influence change to really make that happen.
Why do you think art matters?
Art matters because I think this goes back to a really interesting conversation I once had with someone. This was so many years ago. I think it was on MySpace. I had this decisive moment. I think I was in high school where I understood the difference between the artist and the curator. Someone explained it to me. They said artists are out there to ask questions and create problems. And everybody else, whether it's the curator, the writer, they're here to interpret and answer those questions. And I had this great moment of clarity because, for me, I've always abstractly been interested in art. There was something that gravitated me towards it almost into a spiritual way. I would go to museums because, I didn't have a religion. Once a week I would go to my art church and look at objects, these ritual objects that very few people knew about. So I think that really explained it to me, because I think we need art to have a way to question what's going on in humanity in this world. It's there to confront us with what's happening in life. It's meant to propel questions and really have people respond and think and, capture what's happening in this moment in a visual medium.
Thanks. I promised you this would be a conversation and not an interview, so I want to offer you the chance to ask me some things as well.
Sure. I mean, I think we talked about this the last time we spoke, parallels between your career and my career. We kind of were ships in the night in many ways, between working at the Jewish Museum and then the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. I guess what's my question for you? I guess I'll just turn it around. How did you get into art?
So I mentioned that my grandmother was a collector, and I've talked a bit about how she would just send things. She was in New York and we were in California, and she would just send things out to our house, and my parents would hang them or place them. And they didn't know what they were. They weren't particularly interested in them, but that was my environment. So I spent my youth really making up stories about the things that I lived with. And not dissimilar to you, I went to Palo Alto High School and was just walking by a classroom one day. The door was open because the weather was nice. And I saw slides on the screen of artworks. And I had no idea that looking at art was, I don't know, something you could study, right? So it turned out it was an AP art history class, which I then ended up taking as a senior in high school. And that, again, I never really thought about it as a career. I went then to Penn, and then I needed a job the summer between my freshman and sophomore years. And, you talked about how long ago MySpace was. Well, I looked through the phone book, the yellow pages for an idea, and started with the A's and saw art galleries and started calling around and got this woman named Paula Kirkaby, who had a gallery called Smith Anderson in Palo Alto, to give me a job. And she fired her director 3 weeks after I started, and she let me run the gallery for the summer. And I computerized digitized really the entire inventory. And because, I knew about computers in a way that really no one else did. And I did my first studio visit, and that was with Sam Francis. And then I went back to Penn and I got myself a work study job at the ICA. And it started to kind of dawn on me that I didn't actually want to go to law school, that I wanted to try and pursue a career in art. And very similar reaction to your parents from my parents. And my grandmother actually stepped in and said that she would support me for a year and see if I could make it. And there it went.
I know. I always try to imagine what would have happened in a parallel universe had I not been brave enough to make that decision. And I encounter people all the time who, went to law school, went to medical school, followed the rules, did what their parents told them to do. And it always works out in the end. They quit their job they learn how to paint or do, whatever they want to do. And, you find your path eventually. But I'm glad I had that moment early on.
Me too. I mean, my first job in the art world, really, I was, 17 years old. And I feel so fortunate that I've been able to spend my life around what I love, which is not only works of art, but also artists. So I feel really grateful that my early experience, my first job, also included the artist studio, and knowing that you could spend time with the people that made these sacred objects and hear from them what their intention is and why they made them and how they feel. And I think I would be a very different person if I came to art in a different way. I mean, of course, I grew up around it, but 17 is not very old to have had a studio visit experience. And that really came to define my whole approach to not just my career, but my life.
My other question for you is, what is your astrological sign?
I am a Scorpio, and I am a Scorpio through and through. Passionate, sometimes jealous, not very quick to forgive, totally loyal. So what I have learned in the last maybe 18 months is about the Enneagram. Have you ever done your Enneagram?
What is that again? Is that the one with the letters?
It's a number system.
Oh, so no, I haven't done that.
Okay, so I'm going to recommend that to you because I've always been a huge fan of astrology, and I do check my horoscope pretty much every day and every month, and I find it to be super accurate. Even more accurate on a self-knowledge level is the Enneagram, and I'll just tell you that I'm an 8. So after you do yours, you can circle back and tell me what yours is, and we can compare notes. But it's a really interesting system and very helpful, not just personally, but also in the work environment. For example, my former CFO at the Aspen Art Museum is a 6. And what 6s need from 8s is very clear. 6s are, in general, super precise. They need, so there's a name for each of the numbers too, and I can't remember what they are, but it's insightful. But 6s, for example, get hyper concerned about something. They need to be heard, and then once they're heard and their needs are acknowledged and said that they will be attended to, then they're totally fine and they calm down. So understanding that she was a 6 and I'm an 8 and being able to meet her needs in that way, we always had a great working relationship, but that kind of knowledge from the Enneagram type is also really constructive for work.
I completely agree. I think I learn so much about my friends and colleagues, and you almost forgive them once you know more about how their souls were formed. I'm like, oh, it's not you, it's your sign. I'm actually a Scorpio moon. I'm an Aquarius sun sign, Virgo rising, and Scorpio moon. Yeah, I think there's so much about your approach to life that's determined by just all of these things that you didn't get to choose. And I think confronting that just helps you really understand how to get past it and move forward.
That does seem to be a theme of our conversation today. The nature versus nurture.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for talking with me today. I have been a fan and admirer of your work from afar, and am really glad to be able to spend some time getting to know you, and am grateful for our conversation.
Thank you so much.
Conversations About Art is part of Heidi.art, a multi-platform project that connects all to art through a podcast series, books, talks program, brand collaborations, TV, and more. This episode was produced by Simon Illa. Our theme music was composed by Eric McDougall. Blake Migden assists with social media content editing. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and review us on whichever platform you listened, as it helps us further our goal of connecting all to art. We will be back again every Tuesday with new episodes. Thanks so much for listening.